Hi students, let's talk about pedigree charts. So pedigree charts are sort of like family trees that are used to track inheritance of a trait through many generations. So for example, at the bottom of a pedigree chart will be all of the children. So we could say here the children would be like generation 3, this would be individual 5 and individual 6. And then when we go up one level in the pedigree chart, these are the parents, so their parents would be generation 2-5 and 2-6. And then we go up one more generation, and these would be the grandparents. So the grandparents would be individuals 1-1 and 1-2. So the important thing to keep in mind with pedigree charts is one, being able to see those familial relationships, but also that what we use pedigree charts for is representing phenotypes of different individuals. So there's some common symbols we use to represent this. So the first is circles versus squares. So generally squares are going to be male sex and females are circles. So for pedigree charts, just for what we're going to do, if you see a square, you can assume that is an XY male. And if you see a circle, you can assume that's an XX female. As we've talked about, it's not always that simple, right? But for most of the problems you're going to be doing, that's the assumption you're going to be making, just so that you can actually do the problem. A trick I like to use to help you remember this is that females tend to be like curvy, so females are circles. The next set of symbols you want to keep in mind are white symbols or like open symbols versus black symbols. So whatever trait we're talking about, let's say we were talking about like brown hair, people with brown hair would have filled in symbols. And in this case, we would say they are affected, meaning that they have that trait. People who don't have the trait would have white or open symbols. And then to look at the family relationships, so we use a line that's connecting two people to show a mating, meaning that those people have had children. And then the line coming down, going to this would be showing a son made by this mating. So in this case, we would have an unaffected mother, so mother because she's a circle, and unaffected because it's open, an affected father, and then they mate, meaning they have kids, and one of those kids is an unaffected son. Okay, so it's good to keep in mind that these symbols are always going to be the same. It doesn't matter if the trait we're talking about is dominant or recessive, and that's sort of like what's tricky about these problems. It doesn't mean that like filled in is dominant, it just means that filled in is the trait. Those traits can be dominant or recessive. It just depends on what we're talking about in that specific problem. So don't make that mistake of thinking that just because it's filled in, it's like one specific thing or not. It just means has the trait. Okay, so a quick check for understanding. So here is a pedigree showing a family. So what number in this pedigree would represent the biological mother of this family? Yeah, so it's going to be number 2 because the mother is the circle and they are in the first generation. So what is the number of a male who exhibits the trait? Yes, this is going to be number 5. So males are squares, right? And exhibits the trait means they're going to be a black symbol. So we need to find a black square, which would be individual number 5. Who is not genetically related to anyone else in this pedigree? Yes, that would be number 7. So this would be someone who's like mated into this family or like married in. This doesn't mean marriage, it means having kids. But obviously, hopefully, this person is not genetically related to this person. This just means that they are having children. Okay, so how are you going to have to use pedigrees in problems? So usually the way this is going to work is you're going to need to study the pedigree in order to figure out how that trait is inherited. In other words, is it regular chromosomal inheritance or is it mitochondrial inheritance, which is like a weird, quirky version? Is it a dominant or a recessive trait? And is it an autosomal trait or a sex-linked trait? Meaning, is that gene carried on an autosome or is it carried on a sex chromosome? Once you figure that out, then you can go and use Punnett squares to figure out the genotypes of a lot of the individuals in the Punnett square or in the pedigree, which is kind of fun. So the easiest way to do this is to use this flowchart. So you have this flowchart here that's helping you kind of ask different questions to figure out what the inheritance pattern is for pedigrees. And for all these, what you're going to be focusing on is looking at like families, so parents and children and trying to figure out like how is it getting passed from parents to children. All of these questions or all the stuff in this flowchart is based on Punnett squares. So if you ever like can't remember the flowchart, like memorizing this whole flowchart is kind of a lot. You can work through the same process just by doing guess and check Punnett squares and being like, oh, that would be an impossible option. That must not be a correct answer. So this is just to save you some time by giving you this flowchart. Okay, so here's our first example. Let me move this little, I'll just take myself out of here. Great. Okay, so in this one, we're gonna start just by going through the flowchart. So first off, is it matrilineal? Meaning, is the trait always passed from mothers to all of their children only? And in this case, we can see a father has it and it's passed on to some of his children. So right off the bat, we know that one's no. Is it patrilineal? Is it fathers pass it on to only their sons and women are never affected? So if we look here, we can see that all of the people who have the trait are all squares. So the only black symbols are squares. And no women have the trait. And do fathers always pass it on to their sons? So here's a father and he has 2 sons. Yep. Father with a son, father, 2 sons. So yes. So this one would actually be Y-linked, which is a pretty rare type. You're not likely to see a Y-linked form of inheritance. But these first 2, matrilineal and patrilineal, are both very, very rare options. And so if the easiest way to check is if it's in all males, period, it's probably patrilineal. If it's mothers going to all of their children, that's probably going to be matrilineal, meaning it's going to be mitochondrial. Okay, so how did I know that this must be Y-linked aside from just using this flowchart? Well, it comes from Punnett squares. So now that we figured out that this is Y-linked, that means that this person here is going to be XY because they're a male. And I'm going to put a little A here just to help us notice that the trait we're talking about is on the Y chromosome. So nothing's going to go on X because it's not on the X chromosome. And then the mother in this case would be XX. She doesn't have any, trait alleles because she doesn't have any Y chromosomes. So we can set up this Punnett square like so, and then fill it in. And this is what we get. So we see that if we have a father who has an affected Y chromosome, then he's going to pass that Y chromosome on to all of his sons, and they will also be affected. But his daughters, because they don't get his Y chromosome, they'll be fine. So none of his daughters will be affected. So that's where that came from. Like, it's essentially just doing guess and check Punnett squares. Okay, let's do another example. What pattern of inheritance is observed in this pedigree? So let's do the same thing. Is it always passed on by mothers to all of their children? So here's a mother, she has it. And here she's got a kid who doesn't and a kid who does. So right off the bat, we know that one's no. Is it only fathers passing it on to their sons? Nope. Right here we have a mother who has it. So that one's no. Okay, so then our next question is, does it skip a generation? So the easiest way to answer this question is start at the bottom and pick some kids who have it. So here in generation 3, the kids 3 and 4 both have it. Let's look at their parents. So their dad has it in this family tree. We're not going to worry about mom here because she's not genetically related to anyone else in this pedigree. So in this case, dad has it, and then going up, grandma has it. So it's in every level of that. It's in every generation. Let's try these ones. So this son, 3-5, has it. Going up, his mom has it. And going up again, his mom has it as well. So does this skip generations? In this case, no. So that tells us that this trait is dominant because it shows up in every single generation. Okay, so the next, do any affected fathers have unaffected daughters? Okay, so we're going to want to look for an affected father, meaning a square that is black that has offspring. So if we look here, here's one. 2-3 is a black square. And does he have unaffected daughters? Well, he only has the one daughter and she has it. So that would be no. Are there any affected sons that have unaffected mothers? So let's look at, let's say individual 4 here. That's an affected son. And does he have an unaffected mother? Yes, he does. So in that case, that tells us that this trait is autosomal dominant. So we just worked our way through like the flow chart of information to figure out what the inheritance was. Once again, all of this came from Punnett squares. So you could set up some example Punnett squares knowing that it's dominant and do one with just like big A, little a. And then you could do one and assume it's X-linked dominant and set up those Punnett squares and kind of guess and check your way through this. This flow chart just helps speed up that process. Okay, next example, same thing. Matrilineals that pass by mothers to all their children. So here's a mom. She has kids that don't have it. So no. Is it only fathers passed on to their sons? Nope. We have a mom right here who has it. Does it skip generations? Okay, so let's pick this kid right here in generation 3, kid 9. If we go up, oh, look at this. He has 2 parents who don't have it. So in this case, yes, it does skip a generation. That tells us that this trait is recessive. Okay, so now we have to figure out if it's autosomal or if it's X-linked recessive. Are there any unaffected fathers that have affected daughters? So we have to, let's find some affected daughters. Here, one, go up. Oh, her dad has it. And that's it. That's all that we have in this pedigree. So we would say no. Are there any unaffected sons of affected mothers? So let's find some affected mothers. Here's one. Does she have any unaffected sons? Nope, all her kids have it. Here's another affected mother. She doesn't have any unaffected sons. So in this case, our answer would be no. So that would lead us to the end here, which is that this is X-linked recessive. Once again, you can prove this to yourself by doing Punnett squares, but all we did was just work our way through the flowchart. Okay, last one. So is it matrilineal, passed by mothers to all of their children? Here's a mom. None of her kids have it, so definitely not. Is it patrilineal? Only fathers and sons have it? Nope. Does it skip a generation? It sure does, because here's a mom who has it, and then her kids don't, but then her grandkids do. So we know it must be recessive. Okay, so now we have to figure out if it's autosomal recessive or if it's X-linked recessive. Okay, so are there any unaffected fathers that have affected daughters? So let's find an unaffected father. Here's one. Does he have an affected daughter? No. Unaffected father, affected daughters? No. Okay, so now we have to go to the next choice. Are there any unaffected sons of affected mothers? So here's an unaffected son, these two. And does he have an affected mother? Yes. So in that case, oh, there we go, sorry. Yes, so in that case, it tells us that the inheritance of this trait must be autosomal recessive. So once again, we just worked our way through the flowchart. So once again, where does the flowchart come from? It comes from pedigrees. So now that we know that this is autosomal recessive, I can prove to you how we worked our way through that flowchart. If it's autosomal recessive, that means that we know that anyone who has the trait must be homozygous recessive, in other words, like little a, little a. So we can set up a Punnett square to try to guess what are the genotypes of the parents, because they could be either homozygous dominant, big A, or heterozygous, big A, little a, because both of them don't have the trait. So we'll put the kid here who's little a, and affected inside the Punnett square. And then we'll give each parent one big A, because we know that they have to have at least one dominant allele since they are unaffected. And so we can see right off the bat that if they have to have at least one big A, one dominant allele to be unaffected, but they also had to have at least one little a in order to have a kid who has the trait, that means that the only way that would work is if each parent was heterozygous. In other words, we can know that the genotypes of the parents must be autosomal heterozygous, and then we can go ahead and fill in the rest of that Punnett square. So that's how all of the stuff in the flowchart works. That's where it all came from. It's just essentially guessing and checking your way through all the possible options. But I highly recommend you use the flowchart, because it's just going to keep you more organized and help you practice the problems until you get more used to it. And then you can start to see those patterns on your own. So tips for solving these problems: use the flowchart. It is your friend. And if you're unsure, just make a Punnett square to check your answer. And if you get a Punnett square, you guess at what the parents might be, you do your Punnett square and you get an impossible cross, and you don't see kids that are the right genotype, then you know that you must not have the right answer. So, okay, that's how you use pedigrees to try to figure out inheritance patterns of different traits. Good luck.